Thank you. Well, at first I didn't know who I would expect here, because when I saw the notice, it didn't have the early history of St. John's. I didn't see it, so I wasn't sure who would be coming here. At any rate, my own interest on the early history of St. John's was piqued when I went to the original Museum of St. John's, which was on the ground floor of the college building. And there I saw this photograph of Dr. Sister Mary Glowry, with a very brief note written beneath it, saying that she had the initial vision of starting a Catholic medical college in India. And I was intrigued why I didn't know anything about her after studying here and then coming back to work here. So the first thing that I looked at was the prospectus to see whether I could get something which I could find. And then I was even more intrigued when I didn't see her name on the prospectus. And when I went back to the older prospectuses in the 1970s and early 80s, I found for the first time her name mentioned there, Sister Mary of the Sacred Heart, belonging to the Congregation of Jesus, Mary and Joseph, the same congregation which runs St. Philomena's here in Bangalore. But that's very little to go by, and that started a search which I am going to share with you, because in the interest of time there's only that much which can be shared, and there will be some things which I will not be able to talk about. So, what is the idea of St. John's? How did it originate? And the idea of St. John's, to take us to that, let's go nearly 20 years before St. John's actually started. There was a small publication called the Catholic Hospital, emanating out of the creation of the Catholic Hospital Association of India, and it had this article called "It is Coming." The excitement is palpable, and the "it" that they were referring to was the Catholic Medical College. And there was almost a sense that it would happen very soon. It would in fact take, as I said, nearly 20 years before it reached fruition. But in order to understand the beginnings of this idea, we need to go back even further in time, although to understand the history of St. John's, we perhaps need to go back to the 12th century. We'll skip a few centuries and go to 1837. This is the year that Queen Victoria was crowned in England. It's also the year that the telegraph was invented, which revolutionized global communication. And in this year was a year when the Industrial Revolution was still rampant. Europe was filled with poor people in urban areas and with slums, as was the city of Edinburgh. And into this city was born a girl called Agnes MacLaren. She was a Protestant, born of Presbyterian father, she was very religious, very orthodox, and her father was a member of Parliament in the Scottish Parliament. But even although she was very wealthy and very well-to-do, her childhood was spent in those urban slums in Edinburgh, where she shared her pocket money, and she was jokingly referred to as sister even as a little child. When her father died when she was 39, she actually took on what I think is a monumental decision, because at that time the lifespan of women in Victorian England was only 41. And at 39, her father died, leaving her a huge inheritance, and she could have lived the rest of her life in comfort and, with living on that inheritance. And she makes a decision to become a doctor. At a time when there were very few women doctors anyway, ground had just been broken. And then she does something else which is also very hard to understand. She goes as a very staunch Protestant and approaches two Catholic cardinals, Cardinal Newman and Cardinal Manning. And she asks them to help her get into medical college, which they do. She enters the Montpellier Medical School in France as the first woman student of what is today the oldest surviving medical college in Europe. Salerno has since closed. And she then becomes a doctor in that very strange atmosphere, and she gets registered as the 10th woman doctor in England. Now after this, she then converts to Catholicism at the age of 60, and she now begins to look at a wider role for herself. Now, coming from Scotland, it is very clear that she was aware of the events that were happening in India after 1857, the first war of independence, when the East Indies Company, its importance declined, the role of the crown rose, and in the latter part of the 19th century, there was a spurt of medical missionaries coming into India, most of them Protestant, and they formed part of what were known as the Zenana missions, because they specifically aimed to address the health needs of women, because there were very few women doctors. And Agnes MacLaren was aware of this. And so at the age of 72, she sets sail for India, and she comes and sets up a hospital which still exists. It's called the St. Catherine's Hospital in Rawalpindi. She spends a single year here, and she realizes that she is not going to meet the needs of her women patients. And so she goes back to Europe, and she tours all the religious orders in Europe, asking them to send their nuns to become doctors, perhaps as a late convert to Catholicism, unaware of the fact that the Fourth Council of Lateran and the Council of Tours in the 12th and 11th centuries had actually forbidden nuns and priests from becoming doctors. And so she runs into a wall. She petitions Rome 5 times to get canon law changed, and she fails. And she then decides that she must write and spread the word of the need for women doctors so that it gets better reached. She does that, and one of the people who reads her story is a young doctor in Australia called Mary Glowry. She graduates from the University of Melbourne, and these are all people who are remarkable in their own right. She goes to New Zealand for a year, where she becomes the first woman doctor registered in New Zealand. Returns to Melbourne, starts a practice in ENT. She's a very pious, very religious person, goes to Mass every day, and on a hospital Sunday one year, she goes, the preacher was a Jesuit, encourages all the people in the congregation to move beyond themselves. She goes to a practice, returns home, sees a pamphlet in her mail, and in her own words, she starts reading that pamphlet in her chair. She ends it on her knees. And that pamphlet is the story of Agnes MacLaren, which I described before, calling for women doctors to come to India to meet the needs of women and children. Now, Agnes MacLaren's first urge, Mary Glowry's first urge is to come immediately and come to India to fulfill that mission. But she's also very clear. She will not come to India and be paid for something which she feels is something that she shouldn't be paid for. It's a need which she has to meet. Remember that the church law still forbids nuns to become doctors, and in the same way for doctors to become nuns and continue as doctors. And she wants to become a nun and to essentially become a medical missionary. So she applies to the Pope of the day, and she gets dispensation. She gets the permission to come to India to become a nun and to continue as a doctor. But the First World War then breaks out, and she's unable to travel to India, so she takes on extra training in obstetrics and gynecology, She takes on extra training in surgery, and finally she sends a message to the Archbishop of Madras and Mylapore, a Mill Hill father called John Aylan, and she asks the question, should I now come to India? And she gets a one-word telegram, come. And on the basis of that one-word telegram, she said, sail for India on a ship called the Orsova, which functioned during the First World War as a medical ship. So it's all very strange that this should all fall in place together. 3 weeks later, her ship docks in Madras. 1 day later, the Bishop of Madras sends her off to Guntur, where there are already the Sisters of Jesus, Mary and Joseph, the order, the Dutch order, who've set up a small clinic in Guntur, which today is the St. Joseph's Hospital in Guntur. And it's in this clinic that Mary Glowry begins to work and begins to start seeing the problems that she is going to contend with. And these problems are huge because she's one woman doctor in a very large area. The numbers that are described of the patients that she sees, just in sheer numbers, in quantity, is phenomenal over a period of 10 years. And she just continuously works on that all the time, realizing that she is alone going to be able to achieve not as much as should be achieved, but that she is going to find a way to try and fulfill this need in the future. And she becomes in the process the first doctor nun missionary in the modern world. And at her death, many people spoke about her, and here her spiritual director in the convent in Guntur writes, only very few can combine an interior tenderness and an exterior devotion in their discharge of duties. I can say that Sister Mary led an inspired and angelic life, and for those of you who are Catholics, her canonization process has already started. So St. John's could well have a saint of its own in the future. 1 year into India, she realized that she, like Agnes MacLaren before her, that she would not be able to achieve the needs of her women patients alone. And it is in 1921, in her own testimony, that she writes that the idea of a Catholic medical college came to her. And it was this idea that she shares with a bishop, a young bishop in Guntur called Thomas Pothakamuri, who we will hear about later, who sustains her mission until it becomes a reality. The other thing that is very interesting about her is that she writes that in trying to treat women, she is forced to contend with a single problem. And that problem is of women who have large numbers of deliveries, but at the end of it, do not have a single surviving child. And for her, it was an abomination that while she was trying to save these children, there were the Mary Stopes movement in Europe had started, and it had taken over where there were women who were deciding how they would plan their families, and they were having abortions alongside where there was a need here for women who craved just a single surviving child. And her idea that she communicated, and she was not just a doctor, she was a very well-known Bible scholar and theologian, was communicated in that need to respect life from its very inception. In 1943, together with another band of other nuns, she went about the formation of the Catholic Hospital Association, later on to be known as the Catholic Hospital Association of India. And her initial focus was to really try and stabilize the practice of training for nurses. The history of nursing in India is itself very interesting, because through all that we talk about the medical education, nursing had been neglected considerably, and there were actually very few nursing colleges, and many of them followed very different curricula. But 1 year later, the Catholic Hospital Association of India passed this resolution the association aims at the establishment of a Catholic medical college. And she requested a young Bishop, Thomas Kotakamudi, who now was much older and in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church much better known, to try and push this through with the Catholic hierarchy, because she realized this really needed everyone to see it through. Mary Glowry is buried in Bangalore. She never saw St. John's. She died in 1957. But it's interesting because she is buried at the St. Patrick's Cemetery in a graveyard where all the adjoining graves are the nuns of Jesus, the Order of Jesus, Mary and Joseph. And there is, I think one of the early histories of the Catholic Hospital Association of India actually comments that the batches of St. John's students who traveled to St. Martha's up and down in the early years when St. Martha's was the teaching hospital would have unknowingly passed her on the way every single day. And as you can see, it's a very simple grave. I believe there are plans to change that, but I really think it's remarkable in its simplicity. Now, the idea of St. John's, the vision of St. John's, therefore, I think emanates from the vision of Mary Glowry. But there were other people, I think, who were important to the idea of St. John's. And one other person was a young Austrian, 19 years old, Anna Dengel, who also read the same pamphlet about Agnes MacLaren. Agnes MacLaren was alive at that time, and she writes to Agnes MacLaren immediately and says, "I'm ready to come to India." And Agnes MacLaren tells her, "You will do nothing of the sort. You will be of no help to anyone there unless you get medically trained." And so she goes and becomes a doctor in Ireland. She also applies to the church to become a nun after becoming a doctor, and she is not given that permission. So she takes on her personal vows that she will live like a nun with all the vocation possible, but that is a vow before God. She comes and works in the same hospital, St. Catherine's Hospital, for 4 years, realizes once again this will not fulfill the needs, and she goes back to America. She gets more young women who take the same vows with her, and she forms the Medical Missionary Sisters. And this is a huge organization involved in healthcare. Anna Dengel then continues to petition Rome, and where Agnes MacLaren failed, she succeeds. And in 1936, canon or church law is changed to allow nuns and doctors to become, nuns and priests to become doctors, and in a sense sets the stage for St. John's to fulfill its mission to train doctors who will then go and work in peripheral hospitals of need. This move by Anna Dengel is often not thought about very much in St. John's, but people who knew her work and who know of the order that she created commented about it. And Mother Teresa of Calcutta would say that Mother Dengel's influence went far beyond canon law, because her influence was then multiplied by the number of sister doctor missionaries who would work throughout the world. So far this was an idea, but there was a big gap between the idea and the actual inception of St. John's. And this is the period when the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India begins to take on that formative role of seeing through a project which at many times seemed like it would never ever succeed. One of the early people who was involved in this translation to inception was a priest called Father Moran, a Jesuit, and he was a member of the very first committee which was set up to push the idea of a Catholic medical college through. Another person was another Jesuit, also of the Patna missions, called Father Wildermuth, who later on became the Bishop of Patna. And at this stage, there were two committees trying to work for St. John's, later on St. John's, side by side. One was a committee that was set up by the Catholic Hospital Association, and the second was a committee set up by the CBCI. The two committees were finally merged, and in 1946, not very long after it was set up, the CBCI appointed at that time a young bishop, Auxiliary Bishop Valerian Gracious, and Wildermuth was not yet a bishop, to be in the first committee. And yet, despite setting up this committee, I mean, today we see all the buildings around us, it's hard to imagine that the biggest impediment to the setting up of St. John's was the fact that they could never ever raise enough money. They were literally counting rupees and paise. There was an appeal that went out to all the bishops of India at a later stage, asking all Catholics to contribute 1 rupee on one special Sunday a year. And many people know that. They know there are alumni who might recall that their parents actually responded to this call. And at the end of it, all that was obtained was 8 lakhs. There was not very much money to be had. There was an initial, very early donation from the Vatican of $10,000, and that remained, and nothing grew out of it. And so in 1953, the chairman of the CBCI would respond to a letter from the president of the Catholic Hospital Association, who continued to be involved in pushing this through, and say, we are still studying the possibilities of a Catholic medical college with hospital attached, but the estimate seems formidable and beyond our means. If an institution is going to happen, we are bound to start trusting in divine providence. And actually, there was very little else that they had in hand to start this college. Now into this comes a man whose photograph is large. It is there in the Museum of St. John's. And he was a remarkable man. This is Archbishop Louis Matthias, who was a Frenchman who came as a missionary to the northeast. He was appointed the Bishop of Shillong. The Bishop of Madras and Mylapore was also a Salesian, and he died suddenly, and he was transferred from Shillong to Madras. And it was in his capacity as an Archbishop of a major diocese that he was approached to see this through, the idea of a Catholic medical college. And one of the observations that he made, because India had become independent, and the seats of the very limited number of Catholic medical colleges was being rationalized, he made this comment saying that if we are ever to see our Catholic hospitals, which were increasing in number in the 20th century, needs to be met, we will never meet them through the medical colleges that exist. We will have to start a Catholic medical college. In the late 1950s, in 1958, there was a Pope who was installed, Pope John the 23rd, previously Cardinal Roncini, and the synod or the collection of Indian bishops went to meet him in Rome. He's often regarded as a stopgap Pope. No one thought he would live very long, and they would find another Pope in a few years, but he's remarkable because he presided over one of the greatest events of the Church called Vatican II, which also celebrates its Golden Jubilee along with us here, although it lasted for many more years. And when the bishops met him, the Pope at that time, John the 23rd, agreed that his patron saint could be the patron of the new Catholic Medical College. So from being a Catholic medical college, for the first time, the idea of St. John's Medical College was formulated, but still very far away from reality. The issue of money still remained. Now, I told you about Archbishop Louis Matthias. He went about doing a very detailed analysis of where the Catholic Medical College should be. The initial bishops and the CBCI, which was involved, were really quite remarkable. They tried to gather all the expertise around them because they felt this was something that had to succeed. And you can see that there are many options that they considered. One of the options was Patna, where Anna Dangle had started the Holy Family Hospital, which was a huge hospital. And there were very few large Catholic medical hospitals at that time which could be teaching hospitals for a medical college. When they finally decided that Bangalore was going to be the site, it was actually in 1960. And this is a report that was submitted by Cardinal Valerian Gracious, at that time the first cardinal in India, the second cardinal in Asia, and he calls it Meeting the Challenge. The Catholics meet the challenge. And the concept of the idea of St. John's Medical College, now named, although still not yet in a position to start. If you go to the museum, you will see the picture of this man, Archbishop Thomas Potakamuri. He was the young bishop that Mary Glowry first contacted in Guntur when she had this vision of starting the medical college. But I think his influence on St. John's has been more than just that. He sustained the mission through of setting up this Catholic medical college, and in every one of his reports, he referred to the idea of Mary Glowry. He was very clear, it was not his idea, it was the idea of Mary Glowry. More than that, those of us who live on the campus would be aware, or it would be nice to know, that Thomas Potakamuri, together with the Franciscan friars, bought the land on which the St. John's quarters was built. He also bought the additional land which has since been sold, because at the time of starting St. John's, the total acreage was over 160 acres. Alright, so and he bought this where it was remarkable vision of his, when they already had close to 110 acres, I think it was, minus the quarters and the others that he bought, to actually think that if this institution grew at a time when even the first stone had not been laid in this campus, that they might require more space. And he was also responsible, in his new appointment as Archbishop of Bangalore, to arrange that St. John's would have a first starting home when it was started in 1963. And in his own history, which was written in 1960, he very clearly refers both to the role of Mary Glowry as well as the role of the Catholic Hospital Association in the initial process of the idea of St. John's. When St. John's was finally opened, it was opened on 8th of July 1963. This is Archbishop Potakamuri. And the founder dean, whose history is remarkable in itself, Dean Louis Montero, was to write that this was a humble beginning in a building that had been used as an orphanage. But of the first 50 students, they were eager and puzzled, joining an institution with no past whatsoever, and they were wondering what the future had in store for them. And of course, the initial students of St. John's, the male students, lived in extremely simple quarters. This photograph is part of the early staff who were there. In the background, for those of you all who know, this is Dr. Sylvia Kamath, who went on to become a professor in anatomy. She took leave to actually get training in anatomy, so some of the early batches didn't have her as a teacher. Dr. Kalyankar was a doctorate from Indian Institute of Science, went abroad and then came back as the head of biochemistry. Dr. H.J. Mehta was an anatomist. Dr. Matthias, the mother of the present dean. There are some other people there. If you go and sit at the museum, you will recognize them. But this is a part of a much larger group which started St. John's, and I often wonder what was the motivation when what they had to deal with was constructions like this, which was the students' hostel, and yet there was this dream, and as yet not the money to realize that dream. And so I go into the next stage, which I call bricks and mortar, because there was a sense of impermanence, although St. John's had just started in 1963. Where was the building? Where would it be? Already in 1962, the friars down the road had allowed St. John's to use this building as the first office of St. John. This building still exists. Those of you all who go to the church will see it, and it's renovated. It doesn't look. And there are many students who have come for their admissions to St. John's who subsequently stayed in this as a guest house in the friary. But this priory was at the limits, then the city limits of Bangalore. The acreage that was to be available for St. John's stretched out, and there was nothing in sight. This was the road to St. John's, alright, at that time. And while St. John's was being thought of in terms of its permanent campus, there was an event which was going to be very important for St. John's, which was the International Eucharistic Congress in Bombay in 1964. This was a meeting of the Catholic Church. It's significant for many reasons. One is that it was one of the first major movements out of Rome of the new Pope, Pope Paul VI, and the fact that he agreed for India to be the site of this Eucharistic Congress actually spoke of his very close relationship with Cardinal Gracious, and it was not without controversy, because Cardinal Gracious was a Goan. In 1961, Goa had become a part of India, and Portugal was still had a petition in the United Nations which would continue to the mid-70s, contesting the annexation of Goa into India. And so Portugal actually had a blackout on this entire event. It was a lot of controversy. And it was in this event that the foundation stone of a building that was not yet fully designed was blessed by Pope Paul VI. And since students had already been admitted into St. John's, there were students who were actually allowed to go there and were given special seats where they could witness the blessing of this foundation stone. Pope Paul VI made several additional donations to St. John's out of his own initiatives. And in 1968, when the college building would be finally dedicated, he would write about the importance of having medicine and the role of healthcare workers. And he had an extremely close relationship with Cardinal Gracious, whose interest and work with St. John's spans close to 3 decades. I think it's important to talk about the first dean, because in setting up St. John's could not have been set up without visionaries like Dean Louis Montero. He was already a dean. He was the dean of TN Medical College in Bombay, the 11th medical college in India. And it was through Cardinal Gracious who appealed to him to leave that secure job, to come to Bangalore and try and set up this Catholic medical college. He was an educationist. He was a participant in a lot of meetings at that time, because India was, as a country, was going through an introspection on what they wanted in medical education. The health minister, Amrita Kaur, chaired those meetings. There were expert groups of the WHO, the United States medical education experts who came to India, and Dean Louis Montero was a part of all that while he was the dean in Bombay. And he brought to St. John's all that expertise, and I think it is to his credit that he also was able to bring staff to leave very secure jobs abroad and holding grants, and then come to St. John's and be part of a dream which was in its infancy. And yet the problem still remained. The bottom line was St. John's didn't have money. All this was fine. And the major event that happened was an event linked to an organization called Miserio, which was an organization set up in post-World War II Germany by the Catholic bishops of Germany. And the head of that together was Cardinal Frings, who was an extremely remarkable man. At the time of Hitler in Germany, he would vociferously denounce Hitler. He was a sole voice shouting, and everyone thought that he would at some stage disappear. He didn't. He denounced Hitler right through the Second World War, and together with Monsignor Dossing set up this organization called Miserio, whose aim was that with the renewed economic prosperity of Germany in post-World War Europe, that they would share that prosperity with the rest of the world, and their focus was hunger and poverty. And miserio derives from this saying in Latin and is the word compassion. In the idea of St. John's, they saw a possible fulfillment of that mission, because St. John's was to be started. It would generate doctors who would go out and serve in rural areas, in areas of need, and this is what they committed to. And the contribution of Miseria is not small. They contributed 95% of the first phase of St. John's, which actually consisted of the college, the hostels, some quarters, as well as the upgradation of facilities in St. Martha's so that it could meet the clinical needs of St. John's. We have to talk about Cardinal Gracious, because one of the problems with Cardinal Gracious is he spans so many events through the history of St. John's that we sometimes talk about him in each of those events in passing. But he was actually the thread that bound all these events through, and there is little doubt that he was able to sustain the concerted efforts of the CBCI, which is many bishops which have their own diocese, their own needs to look after, into a single venture of national importance. The St. John's emblem here is actually just linked to the emblem of the Eucharistic Congress in Bombay, and if you want to read more about it, it's in the museum. But Cardinal Gracious was a remarkable man in many ways. He was also very politically astute, and finally 1 year after, or less than a year after the Eucharistic Congress, when the foundation stone was built and Miserio funding came through, ground was finally broken on the campus in Koramangala, and that happened in 1965. And an unexpected visitor at that time was Indira Gandhi. She was the Minister of Information and Broadcasting. She was not expected, she just came there, and she came there because she had a very great regard for Cardinal Gracious. Cardinal Gracious would later on receive at her hands the second highest civilian honor in India, which is the Padma Vibhushan. 3 years later, the college buildings would be dedicated by the President Zakir Hussain, and given the fact that medical colleges were still very few, this was seen as a huge event in medical education in India as well. I do have to make note of Father Loesch, because in trying to build this medical college, there were problems. I mean, the bishops of the day were not unused to building things in their own diocese, but this seemed like a project that was far greater and far bigger than many of the things that they had envisaged. And Father Loesch was a great builder. He was a Jesuit. He built St. Xavier's Patna, he built St. Xavier's Delhi, he built St. Xavier's Jaipur schools, and he built the Holy Family Hospital in Patna. So he had a lot of experience, and he would regularly come down to St. John's, and this is the stone that you have outside the college building, which recognizes him as the vice chairman. He also helped a lot of early students by raising money for their scholarships, and he was also very closely connected as the secretary of the Indo-German Association of Bishops. And so he, together with Cardinal Gracious, was in a sense responsible for interacting with Miserio. I've shown this, and it's almost criminal to have a single photograph of the staff of St. John's, because the staff actually should be dealt with in much greater detail and probably deserve an entire talk on their own. I put them up here because they were remarkable people. They came for a very paltry salary. They deserve to be recognized, and I know that many departments are writing their individual histories, and I hope that the individual histories, some have already completed it, and the individual histories of these departments will actually allow us to recognize these people more. I think it will be very important when that can be collated and archived as part of the history of St. John's. Still a big problem. The college started, but where would the hospital be?
although the Catholic Church had this problem with nuns and priests, they were involved in healthcare and in hospitals right through their history. And the same was true in India. In the 16th century, there were hospitals in Goa, there were hospitals in Cochin. This is one of the early hospitals in Goa where Francis Xavier worked, and it was described as one of the most outstanding hospitals in the world. When you read the descriptions, you would all want to know, why wouldn't you want to be there rather than somewhere else, even if you were a patient? And yet, there comes after that early phase a large period of nearly 150 years when the church involvement in hospitals begins to diminish, and particularly in British India. And that was because the East India Company was a mercantile company. They were interested in profits. It was only after 1857, when the British Crown took over, that we get now a huge rise in missionary activity, and that too initially largely Protestant. And so when Cardinal Gracious and the other bishops decided that Bangalore was going to be the location, and in 1961, when they made the announcement, the very next census year would record that Bangalore city has for the first time crossed 1 million as a population. And the Deccan Herald would write an article saying the conditions in this city, which are growing by leaps and bounds, is unacceptable. There are potholes on the roads, their lighting does not work, and well, it's a repetition of what we say every day today. But this was 1961. And Cardinal Gracious goes to the Good Shepherd Sisters who run St. Martha's Hospital, and he appeals to them and asks them whether St. Martha's will be the teaching hospital for St. John's. And the first reaction of the nuns at St. Martha's is, no, we are not ready. Why us? We have a nursing training program. We are not medical missionaries, and they are not. Their primary work was in education, and even more so in women and orphan children, because their origins spring from the French Revolution, which had a lot of children and on the streets, a lot of women on the streets because of the civil unrest. And here in the center we have Mother Aloysius, who replies to Cardinal Gracious, but Cardinal Gracious is an extremely imposing figure, and he persists, and St. Martha's finally agrees that they will agree to this reluctantly, but only for a period of 20 years. And when St. John starts, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is actually no money. Masirio has given money for the college, but there is no money for a hospital anyway. But they embark on this anyway, and St. Martha's becomes the first teaching hospital of St. John's. The next set of circumstances is really quite remarkable again. In 1968, Cardinal Gracious is getting ready for the dedication of the college buildings. The President Zakir Hussain is going to come. There is negotiation with the US government. The US government is sending wheat to India through PL 480 funds. It was called the Food for Peace program. And the Congress passes a law saying that money can be changed if it's can be used for other activities if it fulfills the need to alleviate poverty and those broad social concerns. And so there is money in India left over from PL 480 funds, and a senator of Irish Catholic descent, Senator John McCormack, then begins the process of trying to get those PL 480 funds used for the creation of St. John's, the hospital on this campus. He's not a small man. He's the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's appointed during President Kennedy's time, and as you all know, President Kennedy was assassinated, and his vice president becomes the president, Lyndon Johnson. And for 1.5 years, Lyndon Johnson is president without a vice president. This man, John McCormack, is the second person in charge if there is a nuclear war to press that button if the need arrives. So he's extremely powerful, and it is through his initiatives that he writes a letter to Cardinal Gracious informing him that I am happy to inform you that this will be released to St. John's, and that it will fulfill the needs of a 500-bed hospital. And so in 1971, the then ambassador of the United States, Ambassador Keating, comes. He unveils the statue of John the 23rd in the college building, and they walk across to lay the foundation stone of the new hospital, which is to be called the Indo-American Peace Hospital. But in 1971, war breaks out between India and Pakistan, and the fact that the 7th Fleet comes into the Bay of Bengal does nothing to Indo-US relations, and so I don't know how the name gets dropped, but it then gets renamed as the John McCormack Center in recognition of the efforts they put. And you would think that with this foundation stone, everything is fine, and it isn't. There is a need for great negotiation. And one of the bishops, which we again have not recognized enough, is a Bishop Jonas Talyat, who belongs to the CMI order which runs Dharmaram College. He was in fact very important in the creation of that institution, and he is also involved in the negotiations with the American officials for the release of US aid funding. And this becomes extremely important, as I will tell you, because even as construction starts and this huge structure emerges out of the foundation stones, and everyone is very happy, it becomes clear that the amount of money that was estimated for this construction is woefully inadequate. India goes through, as a country, goes through a crisis of steel and cement shortage. Prices rise. At one stage, all the contractors go off work. They go and disappear with their workers. The construction is in abeyance. The deans have changed. There is a transition. Louis Montero is replaced by Dean C.M. Francis. Father Loesch has died. All the stalwarts who built the college are now no longer there. And it's in this state that this huge undertaking has to be fulfilled. And it is to the credit of the people who negotiated with USAID that the money requirement is revised, and the USAID finally gives several-fold more than they originally envisaged, and in fact gives 2 more installments. One more with the intervention of another Catholic senator called Zablocki, after whom the library is named, and that sees this entire process through, so that the hospital can be commissioned in 1975 in a very small way, and then in 1983 the transfer from St. Martha's can be completed in the 20 years that St. Martha's gave to St. John's as the time that they would be available for St. John's to use as a teaching hospital. St. John's has witnessed remarkable changes in its landscapes. This is the original plan of the architect Angelo Fernandez of St. John's. It's nothing like that. But when the college was inaugurated, you can see it was then an iconic red building. We'll have to remember that. And it was a state-of-the-art building, designed by German architects. There were a lot of issues with this building. They had huge windows, but they did not realize in a treeless environment that there would be winds which would break those windows, and the windows would then have to be partitioned into smaller segments. And you can see the almost treeless landscape around St. John's. And at this point, when money had just come in for the college, the college building here, and you can see that what might well be the new addition in the Golden Jubilee, not quite as it is envisaged now, but there was a building envisaged which was going to be the auditorium here. You can see that only that building was there, 4 hostels was there, and I think there were 3 or 4 quarters that were built in the St. John's site. No, 5 quarters actually built in St. John's of various categories. But even at this time in 1968, with no money, there was a great design that this would be how St. John's would grow. In fact, it isn't quite that way now, but there has been great growth, and there has been buildings that have come up and things which have come up which would never have been envisaged earlier. I'm going to end with a very brief note. In the interest of time, there is so much that could be said, and what I have attempted to do is to provide just a sort of a story of the events as I understand them. I'm sure that there are other histories There are in fact other histories which I have not touched upon. But among the other early events, one that I would like to touch on is a singularly unfortunate event which happened with the outbreak of hostilities between India and Pakistan, which led to over 10 million refugees coming into Bengal from then East Pakistan. And it threw open the need for St. John's as a new medical college to respond to all the ideals that it had set itself. And so we have here a lot of students and interns, I think. These were provided by Ravi Narayan. And you can see the work of St. John's. And more than just a single event, I think it sets the stage for the disaster relief program and for the continuation of the need to respond to calamities such as these in future years. I cannot also forget my own association with the History of Medicine department and what I am at this point unable to truly establish what I believe to be St. John's first major personal bequest by Major General S.L. Bhatia, pictured here. He was quite ill at the time of the opening of his museum in the basement of the college. It's now shifted to the Research Institute. There is a young student here, Dr. Thelma Narayan, who is with Cardinal Parikatil, who inaugurates this thing. And he not only donated books and pictures and his collection of a lifetime to St. John's, which could arguably have been bequeathed to Grant Medical College, where he was the first Indian dean, or to the government of Mysore at that time, because he was willing to donate entire land. He was a very wealthy man, to set up a state institute of the history of medicine, but it was with very close association with Dean Louis Montero and the conviction that St. John's would carry his legacy through and sustain it that started this. There are other things which I have not put in here. There's the opening of the Ross Institute, which Dr. Ravi Narayan is here and could talk about. I will stop here not because there isn't more history, but I think that this was intended as a walk through that initial period of the setting up of St. John's and the challenges that people faced. And so as we look into the future, I thought that it might just be a good thing to turn our heads back and end with what Sister Letitia, who was the first the president of the first medical college committee of the Catholic Hospital Association, wrote in that initial enthusiasm and desire to start a Catholic medical college. Thank you.